least initially to start with the crimes that would be excludable. And that way there's a lot more crimes that perhaps some of us haven't thought of, though we try to be as inclusive as we can as to what would be eligible and suitable offenses. But this is a list that is certainly open to further discussion. And I think it's a good starting point. And with that, I'll kind of turn it over. I know this is first view for many of you. So perhaps we'll need some time to kind of let this sink in and see if there are other crimes that we're maybe missing from this, or more importantly, perhaps there's some crimes which we think should potentially be eligible, and then we would get down to suitability. So I welcome any thoughts on that.
Thank you, Simon. So I would just raise off the top, just for clarification purposes. I think forgery, there's a forgery offense that in the actual sort of draft document that we have is listed as eligible by review and discretion. It's one of those highlighted ones. So wanting to know if that, if potentially looking at forgery in that way is still on the table. Because I mean, I think that was the original understanding.
I agree, Michael. I think I'm actually on, or sorry, Chris, I think I'm on record as well saying that, hey, forgery is one that we really can have as eligible, right? When I look at that list there, it's really probably more of the identity theft. I would even say that embezzlement in this day and age could be a crime that we at least get to eligibility. And so ID theft, where somebody is taking some personal information and then utilizing it. To me, there's several steps of sort of criminality to obtaining that information, then utilizing it and successfully profiting off of that. But I'm with you right there on forgery and embezzlement, for that matter.
Thank you. And I saw that, I think Kira typed something in chat. Kira, would you like to unmute and say more?
I was just wondering if PC 211, otherwise known as robbery, should be included, unless, because I know that it could fall under burglary, but it is a different code. So I don't know, Simon, if that's kind of what you were thinking.
Yeah, so
about that.
Robbery and any violent felonies, we're talking about misdemeanor offenses here, so we wouldn't have to include robbery, murder, carjacking. That would be too far afield from everything there. But yeah, robbery doesn't even get to our initial threshold of the type of offenses that we're looking at.
And Cheryl.
Really sorry, I thought we were talking about felonies. My bad.
Cheryl?
I want to go back to the forgery, identity theft, and embezzlement. Can you just clarify for me again? Because these are exclusionary. These are ones you want to exclude. And from my perspective, especially since this is a racial justice oversight body, and we typically are looking at the gap, right? And these tend to be a lot of white collar crimes, these especially embezzlement. But the identity theft, you just said that there's a lot of steps that are taken for somebody to have identity theft. And quite frankly, the harm that's caused by identity theft, me being one of those people who have been harmed by this kind of thing, is long lasting and entrenching. So I'm just trying to understand, are you saying take these off of this list? Or I'm trying to understand what your point was in identity theft and embezzlement.
Sure. Yeah, to clarify, these are the crimes that if they were committed would not be eligible for diversion.
I understood that part.
Okay. So
I was trying to understand what your point was when we were talking about it, when Christopher mentioned forgery.
Christopher, we had initially discussed that the crime of forgery would be a crime that was eligible for diversion. And so we were making the distinction between forgery having previously been discussed as one that would be eligible, and now it's appearing on the exclusionary list.
So Simon, are you saying that there's different types of forgery or embezzlement, or?
Those are all different theft crimes, right? Embezzlement. If I work at Starbucks and somebody hands over a $20 bill for a couple of cups, or maybe that's one cup of coffee these days at Starbucks and a cake, right? And then I pocket that, that's embezzlement. I've now taken that from my employer from an entrusted position. In my estimation, in all reality, the difference between going into a store and stealing, as opposed to working at that store and stealing, really should not be a crime of distinction, which then makes one eligible but the other ineligible. Forgery comes in a number of forms. Signing somebody's name in order to pass a check is a form of forgery. Any other document. I don't think that in and of itself should exclude somebody from being eligible for diversion. Identity theft, I put in a different category. I have gone to another individual who engages in criminal enterprise. I've obtained personal identifying information, to which can include social security numbers, bank account records, tax records. I then go a step further and I now profit myself from that information. And I agree that that's really detrimental to the victim's record and the cleanup that has to be done on that. It can be very cumbersome, and it can continue years later. You still get a ding on any sort of credit check. And so for that reason, I don't feel comfortable with identity theft being a crime which we put in the same category as somebody going inside a store to steal, or somebody who's working at a store who steals from their employer.
Yeah, I think it's good to have a list and have some talking points and allow for a robust discussion. So thanks for putting this together. And of course, I bring the public defender perspective, which I understand is from a different vantage point. But if we look at our goal, which is to reduce racial and ethnic disparities in the system, I'm very concerned that this is relatively restrictive. And in fact, it's even more restrictive than our diversion program that we had, our law enforcement assisted diversion program, where at least there was consideration of something like possession for sale of controlled substances or narcotics, if it was sort of a subsistence level dealing allegation. I think there are a variety of charges where maybe looking at some data, for example, many of the folks we represent at the public defender's office who might be charged with just a possession of a firearm or some kind of a weapon are young, and they're often male, and they're often people of color. So trying to address, especially if you think about a first time violation through diversion and really targeting the root causes for folks like that, rather than bringing them into the system that's going to restrict really their success and their ability to thrive over the next decades of their life, is I think what we should be thinking about. And I think for anything on this list, you could certainly bring someone in, and I Cheryl, to your point, lots of charges may have those long lasting impacts, right? But does that mean folks shouldn't have a shot at diversion? And I just throw that out there as something for us to kind of to think about as a group. And for example, a resisting arrest charge, I mean, that can be delaying a police officer. And I can tell you, we're collecting data right now, but our clients are Black and brown and treated very differently by law enforcement, and charges are filed often against them. And I hate to see someone who ends up with that kind of charge on their record based on something so de minimis, often that is during an interaction that just frankly doesn't happen to people that aren't people of color, and people are treated differently across our communities. And that's kind of the point of I see that unless obstruction or delay. But if something's being filed as a Penal Code 148, it is a very low level charge. So, your office, the DA's office, I would think would file something if there had been an interaction where there's kind of force or an allegation of force against an officer. Often, that's what's filed. So I guess I'm just concerned about kind of the breadth of the list. And then I would sort of posit okay, well, what's left? What are we, I know we kind of gave the mandate of, hey, let's talk about what's out rather than what's in, but seeing the what's out list makes me think that like a pretty broad array of criminal behavior is something that we're proposing to not divert. So I guess I'm just concerned that it wouldn't allow us to reach our intended goal of really innovating and reaching, those disparities and reducing them. So burglary is another one. I know you've kind of targeted out the shoplifting, but there are lots of other types of burglaries that are not residential, but various types of burglaries that I think could be discussed. A weapon offense could be, a switchblade, which again, I would argue in the experience that I've seen, people across our county are treated really differently in the way that they're searched or potentially charged with some kind of, a baton or a knife or a switchblade, where if, you're a white male in a pickup truck going hunting, there's one set of principles and actions applied. And if you're in a different community, either walking or driving a different type of car, things just go differently. So yeah, I know we need to start somewhere. So I think it is helpful to put something on paper, and I'm not trying to be, overly difficult, but I do think there are pieces here that are going to get in our way of really moving the system forward in a way that helps people of color, which is our mandate.
Carol, hands up.
I just have to say I agree with everything that Ellen said, only because I think that for every one of these, I can find an example of how the system looks at people with brown skin differently, hate crimes. We find an excuse for Black and brown people, Muslims, different than we find an excuse for other people. And so I think that the list, I'm gonna agree with Ms. Ellen. I think the list is a good start, but I think it's the last one is hard for me. And as a vegan, it's gonna be hard for me to say what I'm gonna say, but we treat animals better than we treat Black and brown people sometimes. So it's difficult for me to say that to get totally behind this list, to not give people, any firearms offenses, any weapons offenses. I've seen people get in trouble when they tell them they, did I have sometimes people have a good reason for having something in their hands, that an officer calls as a weapon. During the civil unrest after in 2020, this one that you're calling resisting arrest, PC 148, officers used every single reason whatsoever to say people were resisting arrest. They were arresting people wholesale for so-called resisting arrest. I watched it from my office in Oakland. So I don't know this. Anytime I see the word any, it gives me pause. So I saw the comment in chat about I would hope that we would look at these case by case. But if we're going to use the word any, that doesn't give me hope that we're looking at anything case by case. Because what usually happens is Black and brown, especially Black and brown young men, are the ones who don't get the benefit of the doubt. And we see that it comes out in I don't need statistics to tell me, but it really does come out in the statistics. And the data has shown us, especially in this county, that it is skewed towards them not getting the benefit of the doubt. And we're trying to make it more so that they're eligible for diversion, not less so. So every one of these is making it more restrictive, no less, that they're going into the system. So how do we make it the other way? I think I want to take it from the other end, is how are we making diversion more, I think, instead of exclusionary, how do we make it inclusionary? Can we take it from that lens maybe? What are potential inclusionary ways that we can flip all of these the other way around? I would be interested in knowing that. How can we take each one of these and make them more inclusionary, especially for younger people? That's my question.
I don't know if Chris is leaving me in charge as the moderator here. I'll just back up, and I'm not going to be defensive. I was just asked to provide the list that previously had existed. And I think the goal that Christopher had today was for us to have these conversations. By no means is anybody saying that this is a final list. Cheryl, I would be really disappointed if hate crimes became eligible and suitable. As a prosecutor, as a white male who has prosecuted hate crimes in this county, who sits on the hate crimes committee for this district attorney's office, one of the only hate crime committees that exists in the state in a prosecutor's office, we would be absolutely doing a disservice to Black and brown and minorities and people of different sexual orientations and sexual identifications if we were to now say that hate crimes were to be an eligible offense.
What offense? An eligible offense?
That would be eligible.
I understand that, but as somebody who has had her car, as somebody who's been the victim or the recipient of hate in this county and nothing done about it, that's a diversion all by itself.
But that's a different conversation, right?
It has been excused by law enforcement here in this county. So it is purposeful diversion. So I want to tell you that. So let's take it from that, okay? So there's what I want to say to you that way. And I'm not the only one. There's a whole class of us where there is purposeful exclusion or blind eye paid to certain types. And that's what Ms. Ellen was talking about earlier. People get looked at differently in this county purposefully. So while I understand what you said, and I'm not asking for it not to be seen in that way, what I am saying though is that just saying the word hate crime is not enough, right? There's no definition behind it to me. Because even when you just said it right now, you still did not say Muslims, right? Muslims is not a minority group. I want it defined. What is hate crime in this county? Because in this county, Muslim, Sikhs, anything that's not Christian is not defined. So when you say this, when someone say this or bring it to law enforcement, it is not met with the same type of anger or the same type of rancor or the same type of this is wrong as it may be for other types of things that you just mentioned. Do you understand what I mean, sir?
I do, Cheryl, and I'll respectfully disagree with you because Monsing Khalsa, who is a Sikh gentleman in 2017, was the victim of a ferocious hate crime in the city of Richmond. I prosecuted that case because any religious creed, no matter who one worships, is protected by the United States Constitution and defined in California under Penal Code Section 422.6 as a protected class. That includes Muslims, that includes Sikh, that includes Jews, that includes any racial identifier, and furthermore includes anybody who is associated with that. I give the example, if I had a transgender child and I walked in an LGBTQ parade and I was struck by a rock by a white supremacist, even though I do not identify as LGBTQ, I would still be protected under that hate crime law. I'm with you in having perspective and your personal experience and your feeling that you've been passed over by law enforcement. But if we don't work to change those systems, and I think that's why we're all here, and to identify those shortcomings, I only ask that you actually look at the work that is being done currently by that hate crimes work, and not just rely on anecdotal aspects. And I'd be happy to put you in touch with Mon Khalsa and what he experienced and what was done.
No, I think you misunderstand me. What I'm saying is, I don't mean just one or two cases. I think you misunderstand me. I think I meant to tell you that I think it needs to be defined, because even when you just defined it now, you didn't mention it. So this is what I'm telling you. It's not any disparaging about what the work that has been done at the DA's office. Is when you just defined it just now, you didn't mention it. And it's not my personal experience that I'm talking about. I'm just talking about overall. I think it has to be defined here if we're going to talk about definitions. That's it.
I know there's a couple of other folks that have had their hands raised. So I want to make sure that we get to their thoughts as well. And just to, this is the first time we're kind of getting deep into this discussion, and it's not just going to be a one-time discussion. I think there's going to be more and more opportunity for us to discuss these offenses, what's going to be eligible, what's not going to be eligible. As you said, Cheryl, we've been talking a lot about how are we defining, how are we creating the language that we need to see for change to happen. And I think this is a good opportunity for us to really dive deep and to get into these a lot more. This is our first time seeing this. So I do think that there's some openness for us to dig a little deeper and start getting more clarity in what this can possibly look like. So I know, Michael, you had your hand up. Kira, you had your hand up, but you put it down. So I'm not sure if you wanted to speak again, but I'm going to go ahead and throw it to Michael.
Thank you. Simon, great work in putting this together. I hope the intent is not being lost, that this was just the starting point. We were shifting the focus from how we were looking at it before to, instead of doing this eligible list, let's just focus on something that we should exclude. So great work in getting this started. And I think it's a great starting point. And just kind of going through the list, I think what would be more productive, I mean, this is our first time we saw your list, is for us to either individually go through this and discuss individually at the next meeting and people a chance to digest it, or for us to kind of go through some of these, because quite a few of these I see should be on the per occurrence, you know, let's evaluate it per occurrence, like the weapon, firearms, that if you said associated with a crime, with a violent crime, then I'll be like, yeah, okay, I'm on board with that. But just a standalone firearms, weapons, possession, that don't tell the whole story. Some of the other things on here, even the discussions, I know we've talked about the forgery, identity theft, embezzlement, and some of those things. The burglaries, if it's not specifically residential burglary, like I think some of these can be moved a little bit or shifted over to the panel that evaluates each individual. But some of these kind of stand alone. So I think that I agree with some of them, some of the ones you have on here, but great starting point. I don't know if it's more productive for us to go through each one as a group or for us to revisit this later after everyone's had a chance to kind of digest it and look it up. And I think your intent when you put firearm offenses, that we're gonna put a category of or whatever hate crimes, we're gonna put the penal code section for each thing that we're referring to, not just hate crimes, not just, you know, whatever the generic term is. So I understand that this will be a little more fleshed out, but great starting point, Simon.
Kara.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, Michael, you've essentially said what I was going to say as well. And again, Simon, thank you for putting this together. You know, being in the juvenile division, a lot of these offenses are on the list of things that we need to consider when asking the district attorney for a petition or not. And there are some cases, as I think I've shared in this committee before, there are some offenses like the DUI, weapon on school grounds, that probation department is required by law to ask for a petition. And I believe the DA is even required to file a petition. But I think what I wanted to add to this was, I would like to think that even though these offenses are listed here, and these tend to be those dealing with moral turpitude, crimes against people, I think the circumstances of each offense referred to us is really important, because the circumstances sometimes may not line up with the crime charged being as violent as it sounds initially by the code. And I like the idea. I remember in a meeting that we had before with Patrice, she did say that there was a committee. I think, Michael, you referenced it. There was some sort of panel or committee that when these certain possible exclusionary offenses were referred, they would go to that panel. The panel would then do a deeper dive, do a little more research, and then make the determination of whether or not the case made sense for diversion. So I agree. I think it's a great starting point. Clearly, it's brought up a bunch of lots of dialogue, lots of conversation, and which I also think is good. But I guess that's all I wanted to say is I would like to see that everything be treated on a case-by-case basis and not put into one box and be treated as such. I think each individual case, each individual needs to be treated differently and separately from the other.
Thank you, Kara. DA Beckton, I saw you come off mute. I don't know if you wanted to say anything, but.
Well, I think most of what I was pondering has been said. Great job getting us the list, Simon. Thank you. And obviously it has really evoked a lot of food for thought. And I think these are the kinds of discussions that we definitely want to engage in this group. The only thing in addition that I had been thinking about was is that I hope we're not in a rush to, finalize this list, because there's a lot of things that I think that are coming up that are going to be very important to what may end up on this list or may not end up on this list. For example, the discussions around what the next steps will be with our potential for getting Prop 47 funds and what kinds of programs we might see there and who we might be targeting. We're still waiting in anticipation to be able to share with you our data that we've gotten from Vera. as we are hopefully going to be bringing that out soon, it will also give us some insight as we have talked about the importance of using data to drive our policy. And so we've talked a lot about the racial and ethnic disparities, but it's going to be really important to actually see where they show up in terms of what is getting charged. And then I think at some point with the data committee's collection of information, we may also begin to see what happens as well on the law enforcement side of arrest and stops and things like that. We might be able to get that data as well. And I think all of those things eventually will inform this list. And I guess the last thing I would say is that when we get to getting a place where we think we're comfortable with the list, that we make sure that it's kind of a living document, so that as we learn new information and as we change and grow, that we always have the opportunity to take a look and see if things that are here are still appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you. Tamisha?
Hello, everyone. Tamisha Walker, Georgetown Project. I think that one, I mean, I have some concerns about this list, but I'm also very clear that this is just a discussion, not a final decision, and that we all get to kind of go back and think about this. Think about, what do we need to consider on a case-by-case basis, based on people's personal experience, and also like where folks are in the moment of the commission of an offense or harm could make all the difference in any one of these. There are some that I wouldn't necessarily immediately exclude, but I know there are processes and procedures put in place, especially as a formerly incarcerated convicted person. I'm very aware of that. One of the things that I also wanted to point out is I'm always raising up language in these spaces. And I just want to highlight that I often hear the term anecdotal a lot in these spaces and data driven. And what I want us to be conscious of is that research and data doesn't always necessarily speak to the personal experiences of individuals in these cases. And when you say that a person's personal experience isn't based on data or facts or research that you have in front of you, is discounting an individual's personal experience. And so I really just felt a little agitated because I hear people say anecdotal a lot. And the reason why we got where we are today in most communities of color and Black folks is because our experiences have been highlighted as anecdotal until you get data that proves otherwise. And I think that that does a disservice for us who are still looking for justice in most cases. So thank you, everyone.
I would just like to piggyback on what Tamisha is saying, and I don't think it's a conversation of one or the other at all. I think one, the personal experiences certainly drive the conversations to even get us to the space of looking at the data. And I think one of the things that's so valuable about the tables that we have in Contra Costa County is it's an inclusive table, so that we do make sure that we are centering ourselves around voices of people who have lived experiences and giving value to those voices in the conversation. But I do think that we still need to pursue the data, because the data also paints a picture. So I'm wholly agreeing with you. We should never discount the personal experience, but I think we should say that it's all of the information together that we need to consider in our decision making. Thank you.
I will just add, when it comes to sort of that last point, there is a way to, qualitative data can be quantifiable, right? So there are ways, some indeed scientific ways, if that's necessary. I don't know that it would absolutely be necessary to the discussion. I think the points are well taken. But for future references, right? If we need to develop a better understanding of what people's experiences have been and quantify those, right? Like via survey, via focus group, via whatever vehicles are necessary, to sort of quantify what people's experiences have been in such a way that they lend themselves toward making certain decisions over other decisions. That's also a process that one can engage in. And I want to thank Simon. I think Simon is going to have to leave us in a couple of minutes. So thank you, Simon, again, for starting this list. Wanted to give you a chance if you needed to say anything before you sign off. And then I see Ellen's hand as well.
No, appreciate Chris. No, thank you, everybody. There's a lot to work to do on this. And as Michael said earlier, this is just a starting point. And I think it's important that we have these conversations, continue to vet this, and really come up with a list that we all can feel proud of, and know that we're going to be doing right by Racial Justice Act, which is what we're all here for. So thank you, Chris, for the time. And I apologize for having to leave early. I just got to jump over to court to take care of some other responsibilities as well. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Simon.
Yeah,
Ellen.
just reiterating what everyone said is that this was a conversation starter, and it sounds like we have a conversation going, which is I think positive to really be trying to hash out these issues. I wanted to respond to Kira's point, which I think is a really good one about having that individualized consideration. However, that's kind of how we got to a system in some ways that's very rife with disparities. So kind of how do you have that balance, right? When we allow it to law enforcement and prosecutorial and judicial and all of the discretion that exists in multiple points of our system, all of the data shows that in Contra Costa as nationally, there are these hugely negative impacts on people of color who are treated really differently. So I guess I do like the idea of really looking at the facts behind a case and not excluding a charge that otherwise on its face might sound like something that people would feel is inappropriate for diversion. However, is there a way to design a diversion program that allows us to also ensure that within those parameters, folks are treated the same? So I just think it's this conversation, I think, comes up a lot when we try to design programs, especially looking at reducing disparities. But I do think it makes it difficult because ultimately you have humans involved and a level of bias, and then we're kind of can sometimes be moving in a circle that doesn't lead us to the place we want to be. But I do think Kira's point that not all behavior that might be charged under a certain penal code is the same by any means. There's a huge spectrum, and if you have a human being looking at that, there's real value. So I don't have an answer. I'm just flagging this.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things too that came up when we initially were learning more about Coco Lee too, like who was going to have that discretion with different things. I think what I would like to see, because there is a subcommittee on this, maybe having you all dig a little deeper with some of these offenses as well, and maybe having more of a discussion around them to bring back to the group, but also maybe coming up with or showing some models of what some other jurisdictions that maybe model programs are maybe doing, even around like, do they have panels that include community on those panels? What are some of those offenses that maybe what we would consider maybe things that we wouldn't go to diversion, but they're actually having some success with them going through diversion, and just seeing what some of those examples are, I think could be really helpful, like to further our discussion as well. And I have no idea like who is out there. I'm sure Chris could rustle something up, but it would be good to like know like what could be possible, or if this is something that we as a county are coming up with on our own and being innovative in how we're thinking about this.
Yeah, notes taken. We'll definitely work on it. I think at any rate, it's probably a combination of both. As we like to say within the Burns Institute, well, some of us, right? I definitely like to say it. A lot of times when you give people specific models that work in other jurisdictions, there are a lot of folks who want to tell you why that would never work in theirs, right? It's like, oh, that's great that works in that part of the country. That wouldn't work here. We couldn't use that. I will definitely work on trying to find, some models in terms of eligibility criteria and even panels and the composition of those panels for determining diversion eligibility. But at some point, and always to some degree, you're going to need to modify those things and make them work specifically for Contra Costa County, and we can have further discussion about how to do that. If there's nothing else, I don't think we opened the floor for public comment on this item yet. So
We did not.
So I would want to do that now, right? Open the floor for members of the public to comment on anything that we've discussed so far concerning eligibility criteria and this starting point of a list in terms of offenses to be excluded.
Jane?
Yep.
You're on mute.
Hi there. Yes, I am very happy to be at this meeting. I'm sorry I haven't gotten to this committee more frequently, as this is an issue that is close to my heart. Several of you know that I have volunteered for some years in a couple of nearby prisons. And I have seen restorative justice work so dramatically inside, and it's always crushing to me that we had to wait for these people to be incarcerated for them to face each other. And I put a couple of things in the notes in the chat, and I apologize if that's not appropriate. But particularly with hate crimes, I don't know how much of you know that there's an LGBTQ support, not just a support group, and an alliance of straight and LGBTQ incarcerated people. And it's been going on for about 2 or 3 years inside San Quentin, or maybe more. And their programs bring together those who are incarcerated for committing hate crimes with people who who identify as LGBTQ. And I have limited training. I only did a 1-day training with Bolt Law School there and the Catholic ministries. But I saw many other people who had committed terrible crimes that maybe affected someone of the same background as someone sitting in their restorative justice circle. So I really just want to lift up, I'm thrilled to hear about the program in the DA's office. And I wanted to lift up comments that were made by Cheryl, Tamisha, and Ellen. And it looks like you're coming to a consensus that a case-by-case that some kind of case-by-case assessment is going to be necessary. So thank you very much for your hard work. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you, Jane. Is there anyone else from the public that would like to make a comment? Okay, seeing none. Next steps, will there be a meeting? Will the subcommittee be meeting before our next meeting?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it clearly seems necessary. That wasn't on the calendar just yet. And the subcommittee is actually like 2 small groups because of just not wanting to violate quorum or, put us in a situation where we need to notice and agendize a meeting like that. But we will, I'll be reaching out to, the folks who were involved in the last round of those meetings to schedule some ad hoc meetings in the coming weeks so that we have something to bring back here for the April meeting.
Okay. Thank you. If there are no other comments on this agenda item, we are going to move on. Chris, I know LaShante was going to be a little late. About what time was she going to be on?
So she said 2:15.
Okay.
And yeah, I was just checking to make sure that that I sent her the invite and the link. I did, and she didn't reach out and say that she didn't get them. So I'm assuming she'll be able to be here at 2:15. So I think what we might want to do here before we sort of try to jump into a Jamboard activity, if we even have time for that, because I definitely, once she gets here, I want to give her the floor and give her as much time as she might need to sort of talk us through how this all looks from her lens. But what I think might make the most sense is to start by sort of going through specifically the slides that are in the agenda packet around the work that had been done already around school to prison pipeline issues by race and ethnicity in the county. And Stephanie, I know you were a part of some of this work. There are some highlights there, I think, in the slides that are shared. Obviously, I think the report itself has plenty of great information in it, but it's a report. It has a lot of pages in it. So I wouldn't, try to, actually read any of that to you guys. But I think the slides themselves are, there's some pretty good information there that we can just review really quickly. And Stephanie, if there's any additional context or background or anything that you remember about those discussions that you would want to share, I would invite that.
Sounds good. And just to recap for everyone, our last meeting, in several meetings, it's come up, what does it look like for us to focus on ways of intervention and prevention for young people. And it seems like there's opportunity and alignment with some work that had been started. And we talked about the Georgetown Project that several of us were involved with, specifically looking at West Contra Costa County and possible alignment with the work of this subcommittee. And so that's some of what we'll be going over today and what LaShante from the school district will be talking about eventually. So Chris, I'll let you run through this and I'll hop in if I have anything to hop in about on. And also DA Becton, if you can chime in, if you see anything you want to chime in about, that would be great as well.
Yeah, so I think for me, I would just highlight, because I don't plan on reading every bit of information that's on every slide to you guys. It's meant to more sort of be a review of the information. So I think, if you look at specifically the third slide in the deck that talks about suspensions and outcomes, essentially or we could actually start at the page before that, just so everybody has a sense of what the scope of the project has been. So that would be slide 2, the project scope. So this group came together with this particular study to examine decision-making in school discipline data and to develop recommendations for protocols, policies, and trainings to improve those outcomes and that decision-making, and to do so with a racial equity lens. And so moving into the next slide, you see suspensions and outcomes, there was a correlation between, or there is, right, always a correlation between suspensions, and I would throw certainly expulsions in there as well, and lower academic achievement, increased risk of arrest and incarceration. That's what we refer to as the school to prison pipeline, and lifelong outcomes. And usually, right, much like sort of what Ellen, so I think so directly and well pointed out before, right, there are different outcomes and just a different way that we interact and respond to behavior, often depending on who it is, right? And that's not just in law enforcement, it's really with every system. And that has plenty to do with just, you know, the history of this country and this sort of culture that we've created around who we value and who we do not, that is deeply ingrained in something that nobody really feels comfortable talking about, which is why it persists, right? And so when we look at how suspension is used, a lot of times it's used to establish order and overlook, you know, the underlying issues that lend themselves to the types of behaviors that are troubling or concerning, or that could be dealt with in a different way that allow students to continue their education and not sort of have these outcomes. So moving to the next slide, just giving folks a sense of what the methodology has been, right, in terms of looking at suspension data. This is data from 2018 to 2019, because I think this work was beginning in 2021, early 2021, and usually if you start at the beginning of a calendar year, then the results or the data from the, you know, immediately previous year usually are not even available yet. And so that could explain why it's 2018, 2019 data that was being used. And based on that, as well as, you know, some case information, interviews and focus groups with teachers and administrators, and reviewing policies and other programmatic data, that's where sort of the takeaways that were developed as a result of this study came from. And I won't get too much into this coding and this matrix. I think for most of us, it's probably even, you know, even with a full screen, probably a little difficult to see that. So I think we can sort of move beyond those slides and toward, yeah. So number one, they focused on low hanging fruit, which is typically a you know, a tactic when you're analyzing or looking at data. You want to start in a place where you feel like you actually have the potential to move something without a lot of controversy. Doesn't mean that that's where you end. Doesn't mean that you end your efforts there, right? As you sort of make headway with, you know, the sort of low level behaviors or low risk, you know, sort of incidents, then you make your way up to things that may be a little bit more serious and severe. But we know we want to start with folks who probably shouldn't be suspended in the first place. And so that meant reducing defiance and non-cooperative behavior. Looks like if you look at just this graph, you had a lot more defiance, at least in terms of, you know, how it was coded, or, you know, what it was, you know, written up as in the school. You had a lot more defiance 2015, 2016. And over the last few years of data, that has consistently been decreasing, which is a good thing. And you see there that someone is quoted, I'm not sure who it is saying we use defiance as a crutch. And often you do see that in schools, right? In my experience, you see defiance or willful disobedience called various things in various places. But often that is used as a catch-all term, or a catch-all sort of justification for suspension and expulsion. I mean, that could be anything. That could be me telling you me telling a student to sit down and that student squatting above the chair to show me up, and me deciding that that's, that because you're sort of disrespecting me, or because I feel like I'm not in total control of the classroom and I'm being sort of made fun of or shown up in front of other students, that I need to now remove you from class for a few days. So that's what defiance can look like. And as you see here, at least in terms of what is written up as defiance, you've seen those numbers have decreased over the last few years. So I think this just further sort of lays out what that can look like, right? So you see that even though defiance is going down, non-cooperative behavior suspensions continue, right? So we're talking vulgarity or I just put those two words together. Vulgarity or profanity towards the teacher is the most prevalent reason for non-cooperative suspension, which is that blue sliver right there. So not a lot, but when it comes to non-cooperative behavior suspensions, that's what is the most prevalent reason for it, right? So think about that. Certainly nobody wants anyone to yell vulgarities or profanities at teachers in classrooms, in front of other students, so on and so forth. Question is, how do you deal with that in a way that doesn't lead to these huge collateral consequences for students, and in particular, students of color? Stephanie, did you have anything on
No, I didn't have anything to add.
Okay.
Okay.
This is my place. I'm sorry. Okay. So next, you see that they just point to ways that some of the data was inconsistently coded. That's basically what the second section is. There's some vague language around what some of the reasons for suspensions and expulsions are, what the definitions of these things are, which lead to discrepancies, which lead to sort of discretionary biases, right, in terms of who's suspended for something and who's not. And as we have covered already, a lot of times that is going to adversely affect people of color, right? People from communities of color are going to bear the brunt of that sort of discretion and that sort of person-based decision-making, as opposed to clearly defined language and examples and understandings of what youth should be suspended for and not. So that's essentially most of section 2. I would just point out in page, well, because you're using the actual PowerPoint, I don't even know how to tell you, but page 25, at least of the actual packet, it talks about some suspensions not being logged, and schools having issues around missing data, which is certainly going to be something that you'll have to deal with, that we'll always have to deal with in terms of trying to make data informed decisions, but something that schools have to, with whatever support they need and us advocating however we can to help, that's something that schools have to take ownership of in order for us to do this work the right way. And I think these last few slides speak specifically to Black girls and suspension trends, which I think is just really interesting. The finding was, according to this study, that they face in the county more, and in the school district in particular, they face more punitive disposition for subjective or inconsistent reasons. So like throwing an object on the floor and getting suspended for 4 days, or leaving class without permission and wandering the halls and getting suspended for 3 days, as opposed to maybe a detention or something like that, like an after school detention or something along that line, right? So again, as you move through the rest of these slides, what you see is that threatening behavior is vague, right? We don't know exactly what that means. That doesn't pass, sort of the objective tests necessarily. It's people deciding upon each instance what this means, what it looks like when they feel threatened by something. And that, again, looks different depending on who's making that assessment and who they're making the assessment of, right? So you see on page 30 now of the packet, the Black girls are overrepresented for incidents involving threatening behavior. And what this tells us is that administrators and teachers are more inclined to interpret the behavior of Black girls as threatening.
One of the things that I'll add, Chris, and I can't remember if it was in this in this presentation or not, but we also wanted to know, like, how many times administrators were calling law enforcement because of some of these incidents. And I can't remember if we got that data or not, or if we were trying to get it and just hadn't received it. But really trying to show what is that connection was really important to us to figure out, like, what exactly is it that we need to do to change how schools are responding to different things.
Right. And I think you may have covered that. I think that may be covered a little bit in the actual report, outside of sort of these slides, which are speaking more directly to, it just seems like this is more geared toward what's happening in the school, like outside of law enforcement getting involved. And I would just point folks to, and Stephanie would love you to speak to this, the last slide of content that has the recommendations that came out of this particular study, right? So you see there gender specific, culturally responsive programming for Black girls, training for teachers and administrators on biases, stereotypes, better data, so on and so forth. I mean, I think it's spelled out pretty well based on what they said. I think the main thing that I would point out is making suspensions an absolute last resort and expanding alternatives, because that speaks directly to this work plan objective that sort of led us to having this conversation in a more robust way recently, right? That's what we want to help the local school systems to do, right? Suspensions are supposed to be a last resort, but oftentimes they get used as classroom behavior management tools, which is not, that helps to lead to the overrepresentation of youth of color in suspensions and expulsions, which translates directly to their entry into local justice systems. And I didn't know if, Stephanie, you had anything else to sort of wrap this up, and hopefully while you're speaking.
LaShante has actually joined us.
Okay. I was just looking through and I didn't see her. But yeah, I see her now. I'm glad she's here. Definitely, I think this is a great sort of jumping off point to introduce LaShante, who I think most of you know, because it was most of you directly who I think Stephanie mentioned, trying to bring LaShante into this conversation. But I think most people there was an overwhelming response to that people were on board with wanting to have LaShante here to bring her expertise and to look at, what can be done to address these sorts of issues, provide those resources as the work plan lays out, and incentivize schools to use these various programs like PBIS and restorative justice and so on and so forth, to better manage behavior and keep those sort of incidents, keep school discipline within the school, right, and not involve the local justice system. So LaShante, I welcome you to the space. I don't even know how to start. There's so much to cover. Just wanted to sort of invite you to introduce yourself and talk about your overall background and connection to this work, and maybe just to review some of the things that we've discussed about how we might go about as a subcommittee working on this particular work plan item, as well as building that vehicle to have those direct conversations with youth. As I think Cheryl brought up last time, right? Like, we don't want to come up with the potential solutions for kids who are in school. We want to be able to dialogue directly with them in some way. And I know that you had some ideas about how we might do that as well.
Yes, thank you. And thank you all for inviting me into this space. My name is LaShante Smith, and I work in the West Contra Costa Unified School District as our Director of School Climate. And it has been, I would say, a long time coming in really prioritizing school climate in our district. And so a couple of years ago, I think it was 2017, our district passed a positive school climate resolution. And this was out of basically just looking at the data in our district around exclusionary practices, meaning like suspensions and recommendations for expulsions, as well as law enforcement referrals that stemmed from a school site. So if a student was kind of engaging in behavior at the school site, law enforcement may become involved in that, and then a student was then kind of tied to the system. And so this resolution was really built out of a need to ground district practices in more of like restorative and healing centered practices, and not go straight to these exclusionary practices. So anyways, that happened back in 2017, and we committed to kind of designing systems of support for our students and really thinking about what our young people need at school so that we can better support them there and not have to use more of these punitive measures. So that happened back in 2017. And I can say that although we passed that resolution, we didn't really have the funding behind it to fully implement it. So it's just looked different in different years. And then a bunch of us went to Georgetown, where we started to think about this issue around exclusionary discipline and the direct kind of linkage to the justice system, which is known as like the school to prison pipeline, and what could we do and put in place as a multidisciplinary group while we're focusing on our school sites. So we went to Georgetown and we engaged in kind of this capstone project where we wanted to look at the exclusionary discipline processes that were happening at school sites. We were looking at the number of students who were referred to law enforcement, and we wanted to kind of put some checkpoints in place so that school sites would use restorative justice responses, and school sites would use different strategies instead of like suspension. So we did that work together as a group. And a big part of it was looking at the data. And so we partnered with Impact Justice, and I think Chris shared the report from Impact Justice, but that report really was looking at just our responses over the last 5 years and how we were responding to student behavior issues at the site. And I think what was different about this data pool or this data analysis is it really looked at, okay, if a student was suspended, what were the number of, like, how many days were they suspended from campus? And if a student engaged in a particular behavior, were they offered other means of correction? So did they participate in restorative justice practices? Were they, put into an intervention on campus, or was the first response suspension? And so from the data, and I'm sure you all already seen it, is we have been disproportionate and continue to be disproportionate. But what was like a new fact that was found, although we already kind of knew it, but was supported by the data, was what's happening to Black girls in schools around exclusionary discipline practices, and particularly around just kind of the consequences that happen after a student engages in a certain behavior and the number of days they may have been excluded from a campus environment, and how that reentry to campus, what that reentry process looked like. So all of that had happened. And then our next step was to actually engage our young people and engage our community and try to come up with a strategy to support our school sites with the appropriate training, with the appropriate, one of the areas that was identified as an area of need was just how we code things, how we look at things. So we know there's a level of bias, there's a level of training that needs to go, there's a deeper level of training for our school administrators. And I think with COVID and the pandemic, the work kind of halted and our district leadership shifted. And so now we have new leadership, but this has been a continued concern around just school discipline practices and what we are able to offer our students on our campus right now. And I come to you today after a crazy week of an increase in violence on our campuses, an increase of students bringing weapons to school, and now community outcry around we're not doing enough for our students, and community wanting us to go back to some more punitive practices and putting other things in place. So there has been a community outcry for putting metal detectors in schools. There's been community voice around searching every student when they come in the door. There's been an increase of like, we're not doing anything for students who are at risk for community violence. So there's a lot. And so I'm coming to you today with, I think there's just a clear connection, again, between what's happening in our schools and how our young people are then becoming system involved. And so if we could get around what's happening in our schools and support our students at the school site level, and really collaboratively design something around more of like a youth focus group, talking to our young people, seeing what the need is, understanding kind of the reasons for this increase in behavior, I think we can then design something that can be used throughout our system. I'll stop there. I think I answered all of the questions. Did I, Chris? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think you covered everything, that I was asking for in the beginning. The only thing that I would ask is, I think when we met, we had a conversation about restorative justice and how that's been going in the schools, what that's looked like. And I think that might be, illuminating to hear about a little bit, because we want to make sure that, whatever we come up with is sort of implemented fully and implemented well, and done correctly so that it has the greatest impact. And I seem to remember some insight that you had about RJ practices in school right now.
Yeah, so we've had restorative justice practices in schools to a varying level of fidelity. And I think the biggest issue is that we haven't been able to sustain a high level of support in using restorative justice practices on school sites. And so what it looks like right now is that none of our sites have RJ coordinators. So that work usually is in the hand of a school administrator. And sometimes they will use restorative justice responses to discipline, and other times they're overwhelmed with other things going on. So they're not able to fully implement an RJ response. So then what happens is we kind of revert back to more of an exclusionary response, or kind of getting a student out. And it's more of like, I need a quick fix. A student has to go home. But that reentry is not restorative as well. Back when we had more funding, we were able to implement restorative justice at some of our school sites. And so that looked like an actual person being on site who would provide training to teachers, provide trainings to site admin, and they were really able to engage in more restorative responses with community. So there could be an issue happening in the community that was spilling over into the school site, and that person would actively engage young people, bring everyone together, and have more of like a community RJ circle, if you will, and continue working with different groups of students, staff, families to come to a solution. And then when they were returning back to school, they would be engaged in like a restorative reentry process. So we know that you may have been suspended for X, Y, and Z, but you're coming back to like a circle of support. So what supports do you need here at school site? Who would be responsible for what? And so we would continue kind of that monitoring. But right now, because we don't have the necessary resources on our campuses, the level, again, of restorative justice and the implementation is varied throughout the system. So I can't stand and say that we're fully implementing RJ because we don't necessarily have all the resources to do so at this time.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And I guess so you mentioned before, and you just kind of mentioned in a different way here, that reentry process is really important, which is, I think, something that I hadn't really focused very much on in my work in this area. So, anything in addition to what you described, even for, say, a person where there is not a restorative justice, say for a school where there is not a restorative justice practice or culture, what are some of the things that are helpful for schools to be able to have in terms of reentry for students?
I think the first would just be like the training and making sure that it's done. So any student that leaves our campus for any amount of time, whether it be because they're returning from kind of the system, they're returning from suspension, they're returning after just being away for a period of time from school, they should come back to that like reentry process. And that process should be like all staff aligned to understanding what that young person's needs are at that time and putting a plan of success in place with supports to reach goals. And so I think a lot of our school sites have just said, one, we just need the training. We need to know what this process looks like. And then we need to know what resources are available to support that young person who's coming back to our system and kind of doing that resource linkage and then making sure everyone is on the same page in regards to how we're supporting that youth in front of us. Yeah, I think that's the main thing. The other thing I would say that needs to kind of be something that's addressed is just how we respond to different incidents and making that not so subjective. I think there's a lot of students that get different consequences based on like kind of our data analysis and looking at what's happening at the school sites. So we do need to kind of norm is what one of the recommendations from Impact Justice was, like norm around these behaviors that we're seeing and norm a process that we would all follow across our district, and make sure that we're involving different partners and organizations to support us, because we know like something may be happening at the school site, but it's not just at school, it affects many other systems. And so how are we like all coming together around that?
Good point raised in chat. Might be a good time to stop sharing our screen so we can have a discussion. It's not my screen. I think that's for Nicole. Thank you. All right. I've sort of been hogging the questions right now, and I don't want to continue to do that. Certainly want to open the floor for other folks if you have any questions or comments around how we can go about working with LaShante from her lens, sort of helping to guide the work on school to prison pipeline issues from this RJOB perspective, what that can look like, what it should entail. If folks are interested, certainly members are invited to chime in, and then we will open the floor to public comment to hear from members of the community as well.
Hi there, I'm here again. I thank you so much for that report. Ms. Smith, I just put something in the chat I'm curious about, and if I missed it and it was there, please forgive me. How does the presence of SROs affect these outcomes? I was really dismayed to learn recently that there is an effort on the school board in West Contra Costa to reinstate the SROs. The board a few years back voted to get them out. And my understanding was the money involved might be going to social workers and others like yourself, so badly needed for many students who getting some personal attention can make all the difference in the world. So yeah, could you talk a little about the SROs if you haven't done so already? And if I missed it, I apologize.
No worries. So yeah, during the past, I would say 2 months, there has been community members who have been very vocal around reinstating an SRO program. Some community members feel that the presence of an SRO on a campus would then make our campuses safer as regards to students bringing weapons. But it's always been my position that an SRO is not going to stop a student from bringing a weapon on campus. And we have to continue to invest more in the social and emotional supports for kids and thinking about what that really looks like and creating the environment where students do feel safe, where students feel connected, where students receive support. And so I want to take us to our data too. When we had SROs on campuses, there were still weapons on our campuses. There were still incidents of violence. There were still other things that occurred. So I think that we have to, again, get back together and look at, because one of the issues is too, when we removed SROs from our campuses, we didn't necessarily replace it with something else. And so I think we need to go back to that drawing board and bring community in and bring different stakeholders in to think about, in the absence of an SRO on campus, what does that look like? What supports are now available? What direct supports are available to students? What indirect supports are available to students? And there has to be continued conversation around just the relationship between police and school sites in general. So I hope I answered your question, but right now we kind of are in kind of that conversation piece and thinking about what is best for our sites and what that relationship should look like, and looking at it from both perspectives.
Well, I'm glad you're there.
Thanks for your comment and your question, Jane. And I just want to make sure that the committee members have a chance to ask questions before we open it up to the public.
So sorry, I guess I misunderstood.
So one thing that I do want to bring up, and I think that it's perfect for this conversation right now, LaShante mentioned about the positive school climate and kind of implementation of it happening in various ways, and then actually not having like full support of like being fully implemented. And I think what we're seeing now, especially with some community members saying like, now we want to see SROs on campus, we want to see more law enforcement. It's a direct result of kind of this not a wholehearted attempt to really focus on what does school climate look like in West County. And it was really young people and other community folks that were pushing for a change in how the school and law enforcement were implementing different tactics. And so I think that's why it's important for us as a committee too, to figure out like what exactly does it look like for us to have some type of involvement in this, because we are looking at how can we, even with the diversion things, we're looking at how we can be more innovative in how we're supporting young people and adults. And so this is a perfect opportunity to figure out what does that support look like. Tamisha.
Thank you for the presentation, Chris and LaShante, for talking about the issues in West County and you all's experience and research you all have done. I wanted to like say a couple things before I have a question, because I do have a question for LaShante. Is one to clarify, not all parents are asking for police back on campus. Some parents just don't know what to do because alternatives haven't been offered. So I want to raise that up. I also want us to be conscious of that. It feels like it's been forever, but it's been a grueling couple of years with the pandemic. Young people's academic life, community, and family lives have been absolutely uprooted. They've experienced loss of family members, loss of their independence, loss of being able to be social with their friends and in community. And that's a heavy burden for young folks. So what we're seeing is just like the sheer lack of thoughtfulness and even reopening schools. Just like no thought was put into the potential trauma that young folks have faced that will like pour over onto campuses. And this isn't just happening in West Contra Costa, because it's happening every day in Antioch, and I'm pretty sure other schools as well. And so given that this is a countywide body, I hope that we can reach out to the various school districts and kind of figure out, what they're facing as well, so that these recommendations could suit the needs, especially of districts who are overwhelmed, have already had an overwhelming number of young folks who have had like negative experiences in community and work, struggling before the pandemic, struggled during the pandemic, and then came back to campuses that were unprepared to address the compounding issues that they had just faced after being launched into online learning, as well as having their lives just kind of turned around. And so there's been like fights, there's been a lot going on. So I guess what I'm kind of wondering is that, one, thank you, LaShante, police on campuses don't prevent young people from bringing guns. It never has. There has to be something else done around that. And that I know a couple school sites that do have metal detectors. I'm not sure how comfortable I feel with that, but I know that there are schools that have the highest number of young people who are impacted by the criminal legal system as well. My question is, what did the district do, if anything at all, to prepare for students to come back off the like pandemic, being launched into online learning? What conversations were had about like the social, emotional, and mental health needs of young folks, and what the district could possibly be dealing with as young people came back?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your comments. So when we were kind of coming back to school, there was a committee, a reopening committee, kind of looking at what we would focus on as we return to school. And so our district, we got a new superintendent in, I think it was June, who came on, Dr. Hurst, and his kind of reopening motto was around a restorative restart. And so the first 6 weeks was focused on building relationships with students, welcome them back into the classroom, and a focus on social emotional learning. And with that, we implemented kind of like a mental health screener, if you will. So as students were reoriented back to the class, there was an increased focus on student mental health and behavioral health needs. And then students were kind of surveyed or given this screener to identify any like more of a internalizing issues that could have they could be impacted by, or more of externalizing issues that were going on. And then the school sites were beefing up their care team process to identify students who were more at risk or in need of immediate mental health or behavioral health supports. And so that process went through our partnerships with community-based organizations and our health centers. But in addition to that, we have been hiring right now, in the midst of hiring social workers, clinical social workers, who have now been tied to school families and who are providing direct support to students around mental health needs, behavioral health needs, and they are also not tied to any particular funding source. So what we found was that students had difficulties accessing services because of insurance or lack of insurance. So these are providers that are able to see all students. And so we're working on beefing up that so that there's more providers on our campuses, and then that there's more access to services. And we're trying to ensure that the students who need the services the most are able to access immediately. And so that was those are just some of the things that we did, but there was supposed to be an increased focus on student mental health needs. We named it as a goal, and we're actually still in like the monitoring phase of that. We just signed another partnership with an organization to connect our most vulnerable youth to some more services, because again, like what's happening in our schools is not just isolated to the school environment. So we're trying to work on ways to support young people faster, and so that they get the help that they need. Hope that answered your question. I'm happy to talk more about just kind of this restorative restart and the plans that were put in place, if that would help.
No, that was helpful. My follow-up to that is, given all the you all want to achieve and all of this work that has been done specific to your district, how will budget cuts impact any of these efforts that you all want to do? Because I also heard that there might be potential funding from this end to help start up stuff and get school districts prepared to do more restorative practices from like advocacy in this group. Do you perceive that any budget cuts in your district would impact the efforts that you all are trying to accomplish?
I do, and that's my greatest concern actually right now. We had a school board meeting last night where we had a negative certification on our budget. And so there is actually a hiring freeze that was implemented as of today. They aren't supposed to freeze essential services. So we do have a couple of social workers that were already on the books that we can still get filled. But as far as additional services, because even with the services that we have been expanding, it's still not meeting a need. But we don't have funding for additional services. And so just the way school districts are funded and the under-resourcing of districts, there's going to be a huge need to find other revenue sources so that we can get support on our campuses. And so, yeah, any ideas you all have or any, ways that we can work together, it's the need is tremendous, and we don't have the funds to support the need.
Cheryl.
I don't know what to say. It's a vicious cycle because a lot of these children are traumatized. And so it's not just mental health, it's they're dealing with PTSD, right? And it's a whole different kind of mental health that's not being addressed. So Ms. Smith, is the conversation before this meeting, I was on the phone with two parents from West Contra Costa who were upset about last week's meeting with the budget cuts and then last night's meeting. And they were with the Black Parents Group 8 West Contra Costa. And that was one of the words that they use is post-traumatic stress syndrome. And this is what they want to have addressed with, the PTSD, not only from COVID and what Ms. Tamisha just brought up about them being separated, socially and isolated. And then the ones who have been in the system, right? And just the trauma from being in this carceral system as young people and not being properly reintroduced into the school system. There's adults who can't handle that transition. And then we expect young people to handle this transition without proper supports. What are we doing? And how are we handling that? And is anybody talking to the young people about their needs? Or are we still making decisions for them without talking to them and bringing them in to the conversation and asking them what they need? Because I keep hearing about these programs, and even the superintendent, as nice as he wants to be, but I haven't heard where we're asking young people to speak for themselves and asking them for advocacy on behalf of them and their group and their needs.
Yes, and we can do more advocacy around youth voice or just having youth advocate for themselves. But right before we returned to school, one of the stakeholder groups that we worked with was our students. And so we have this all student Congress. And what they did was they helped to design kind of the questions. They helped to design a return to school survey. They helped to design what they wanted to see at their school sites. And there was a lot of information that we got from that. And then there's a lot of information and a lot of things that we still need to do based on what we heard. And so I was talking to Chris when he originally spoke to me about this. I think the next big part is engaging our young people, especially the ones who are being most impacted right now by our policies and things that are in place. And so I'm hoping that we can design something. We were already in conversations with several youth groups across our district and having them come together to design with kind of like a youth listening session at their sites, and then taking that to like another level of based on the feedback, how can we put other supports in place across our school sites? So I hope that answered your question. It's more of like, yes, it has been done, but it needs to be a vocal point. It needs to kind of be at the center of all of our conversations around how are we engaging our youth who are actually at the schools.
Yes, I think it's the last part that I wanted to hear, that is going to be more deliberative. Yeah, and built into the process. Their voices are built into the process. Yes.
Right.
Thank you.
Could you say more about, and it's okay if the answer is no, but are there any more details about that listening session? Is that something that you're expecting will take place relatively soon? That seems not only aligned with sort of the objectives of this group, but also community engagement and funding subcommittee is wanting to do a very similar sort of thing to make sure that for any and all recommendations coming out of this body, that there are young people, because they're implicated and or affected or impacted by some of the decisions that will be made, to make sure that this group could even hear directly from youth on all of the items that would impact that population specifically.
Yeah. So we've been in several meetings around what this could look like. And the next step was to reach out to several organizations to help us design this. But the thought is that we were talking to a group of students who were kind of involved in some disciplinary processes. And they were like, look, we know what we need. We know who the students are on our campuses that need the most support. Listen to us. And so that kind of stemmed more of how do we design spaces on campus where adults don't do the talking, but they do listening, and they sit and they listen to what's being said. And so instead of us coming up with some strategies, we would intentionally have questions that are answered by youth, and they would basically be telling us what they need at their school, what they're experiencing, and what their perception of just overall safety and climate is at their school sites. Now, we've identified some young people who want to help design that process. So I was just in a meeting right before this meeting about like next steps and engaging our community to help us design this process at our schools with the intention of it being, one, listening, but then two, hearing what's being said and then putting some strategies and supports in place based on what we heard. And so some of our young people say like, we tell you this, or we'll fill out a survey, and then we don't see any action from it. And so it's kind of like a two-part process: one, listening, taking in the information, and then having some clear action steps. And I think right now what we're, again, trying to determine is some youth are super interested in designing things or in leading circles or rallies, but sometimes we don't hear from our most alienated voices. So we're trying to uplift those voices as well so that they can be a part of the design process. So we're identifying kind of the students across the campuses that can be in the design process. And then we would be doing this across our campuses with a focus on our secondary campuses starting in 6th grade for the youth groups, youth focal circles. But that's all we have right now. It's definitely in a design phase, and would love feedback from this group, support, whatever you can offer.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Tamisha, I see your hands up.
No, just wanted to thank LaShante for raising up, because I was going to ask the question about the hard to engage student population, the ones that aren't necessarily just like gung-ho to step up and help lead anything, but are directly impacted, but are like most marginalized, most impacted by criminalization in the district and harm. And just hearing you say that there are efforts to figure out a way to include those voices. I really appreciate that. I want to thank you for that. Also want to raise up that there are also folks who are providing services in school sites who some students who are excluding students from their services based on behavior. And then those students don't have anywhere to go to get the life skills and support that they need because they've been excluded based on behavior they're currently presenting that the program is supposed to help, but instead the program, instead of assisting them, excludes them based on the actual behavior that qualified them for the program anyway, which is ridiculous. I guess my question is to this group. My earlier statement around this is county-wide, and like, I really want to know what's the energy of this diversion committee to have conversations with other districts if that hasn't happened already. Are we on a timeline? What is this all going to look like? And if that's something folks want to do, I'm interested in stepping up.
I definitely think that there's energy around that, Tamisha. One of the things, and this is the first conversation, just kind of getting a glimpse at what's happening in West County. Definitely know that there's things happening in East County that we need to be focused on as well. One of the things that I'm doing is looking up I believe it was an Antioch school that was doing some similar work and has some similar things going on as what's happening in West County. And so any support or contacts that you have in East County, I think would be good for us to connect with as well. But definitely looking, I think because, you know, West County was one of the focuses of the Georgetown group, that's one of the reasons why we wanted to make sure that LaShante could present on what's going on with West County. But definitely looking at how could something look across the county.
Yep, and I would just add really quickly, that's why we were, so that's part of the reason we were supposed to have the jam board session to sort of talk about what programs may exist around the county that we may want to, you know, tap or learn more about in terms of sort of, you know, embarking on this work as we reach out to the other the school districts within the county as well. And Michael, I saw your hand, just making a really quick comment. Didn't mean to discourage you. You put it down, but I welcome you to speak.
I just kind of had a quick question. So within this county, what efforts are, I mean, can you just discuss, Shante, great presentation, by the way. Thank you so much for being here with us and sharing. Well, what if, my specific question is about the training of the staff and the teachers, and it seems like there's that huge issue with the suspensions and with the reducing defiance. So what kind of training's been done on a staff or a teacher level about dealing with students and labeling them defiant or non-cooperative? And I know that happens all the time for people of color to be put these they're angry black man or these defiant people just by speaking up. You're defiant. But what things are being done to train faculty and staff with dealing with this type of behavior and their own implicit biases?
It's a great question. So I can say that we've had training, and again, it's to a varying level, because there's other issues that come into play with training an entire like district or teaching staff. One, teachers have to want to be trained or have to want to receive the training. And as far as mandating any training, we can't mandate it, but we can highly encourage it. And then the ones that we can mandate, it's, you know, we can only mandate so many hours per their contract. So we've started with like implicit bias trainings. We've done affinity spaces. We've talked about like anti-racist practices. We were engaged during COVID, actually, when we were on remote learning. Every Friday was dedicated to teacher professional learning. So students would not be in school, but the teachers were required to go through professional learning around anti-racist practices and creating those in the classroom, and what does that look like? And that was the first time that we were able to engage in that level of training, because I think that's where it starts. In kind of what we're seeing subjectively across our system. But after that kind of Friday training, this year, we haven't been able to do that same level of training. So it was up to the site to pick it up. So some sites have fully trained staff in culturally responsive practices and anti-racist practices, and in best practices for supporting student behaviors. And then others may have new teachers or teachers that have not been trained. So I think training has been a big need, and really designing what training looks like at our site is another need.
Thank you. So I know we are actually past time, but I wanted to reopen this for public comment in the event that anyone from the community wanted to speak on it before we review any next steps. Although I think Stephanie kind of captured them pretty well on the earlier agenda items, and then adjourn the meeting. So any additional public comment on this item before we move on? All right, not hearing any. Stephanie, did you want to review any of the sort of action items or next steps based on the conversation we just had before we adjourn?
Don't think so. I thank everyone for having a robust conversation. I can't believe we've gone over. I don't think we've ever gone over time in this committee, but appreciations for staying on just a little bit. I think one of the things, like we talked about earlier, the subcommittee that are looking at criteria will be meeting again. So I'm sure we'll have some updates from them at our next meeting. And I think for some of the school-based things and looking at interventions, and also looking at how are we looking at things across the county. I'm sure either Chris or I will be reaching out to some folks so we can get a better understanding of what's happening, so we can also discuss it at our next meeting. So appreciation to everyone for being on today and giving all of your thoughts. And our next meeting will be April 21st. So thank you. The meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thanks, Stephanie.
All right, bye you all.
Thank you.